Fatima Kama was born in Morocco in 1971. In 1990, at the age of 19, she moved to Montreal with her parents, where she gained Canadian citizenship in 1997. She had studied accountancy, but her true passion was to sing. This is the path Fatima chose to follow, and eventually she became a well-loved cabaret singer, performing at hotels, restaurants and weddings. 1998 and 99 was a busy period for the now lively 28-year-old. She had spent 8 months of that time in Lebanon, singing at weddings and private functions. Then in July of 99, Miss Kama travelled to London on an Air Canada flight for a planned week-long visit. It was her second visit to the city in the last 12 months. She arrived on July the 10th, with a planned return to Montreal on the 17th. She was a regular visitor to the West End of London, where she was said to have many wealthy friends and admirers, willing to help her in her career and to fulfil her dream, which was to record an album. During her time there, she stayed at a flat at Portsea Hall, just off of Edgware Road in the Marble Arch area. She began renting this property in May of 99 during her first stay in the city that year. The owner and landlord was a 24-year-old Lebanese man named Abdel Wahid. Very little is known about Fatima's time in London during her July stay. The week passed and Fatima's return date of the 17th came and went. Her parents back in Canada eagerly awaited their daughter's return, but she never showed up. The truth is, Miss Kama was at Heathrow Airport on the day of her return flight, but under circumstances her family would not be able to comprehend. On the evening of Saturday, July 17th, 1999, an unattended suitcase was found by members of the public on the third floor of the airport's Terminal 3 car park. The 3-foot by 2.9-foot suitcase, which bore the label Blackpool, New York, had been left there on a trolley. Security staff were called, and they opened the case. Inside they found the body of a woman curled up in a fetal position. Her throat had been deeply cut, and she had been stabbed several times. A post-mortem examination at the Ealing Hospital mortuary revealed that she had suffered at least 10 stab wounds and had been sexually assaulted. 2 days would pass before the body was identified as Fatima Kama. It wasn't until they had received reports of her disappearance from friends in London and family in Canada that London's Metropolitan Police put 2 and 2 together. When detectives entered the flat at Portsea Hall, they were faced with an apparently undisturbed scene. There were no signs that a struggle had taken place. Everything looked normal. Unsatisfied, they looked closer, carrying out a careful examination of the property. They found traces of diluted, splattered blood on the carpets and skirting boards. The pattern of the blood splatter suggested that a murder had almost certainly taken place, and someone had attempted to clean it up. The obvious suspect was Abdel Wahid, the owner of the flat. At around 10 p.m. on Monday, July the 20th, Wahid was apprehended and taken into custody. It looked like an open and shut case. The police appeared to have their man, and they thought it was just a matter of time before justice was served. The thing was, Abdel Wahid was not the only other person with access to the Portsea Hall dwelling. It transpired that on her arrival in London on July the 10th, Miss Kama was told that she would have to share the flat with the landlord's brother, 29-year-old Kuwait Airways steward Youssef Wahid. When questioned about Youssef's whereabouts, the younger brother Abdel had little or no information to give. But police soon discovered that Youssef Wahid had left London just hours after Fatima's body was found. He had flown from Heathrow Airport bound for Lebanon on a one-way ticket, paid for in cash. At this point I should mention that Abdel Wahid, Youssef's brother and owner of the flat, although charged with assisting an offender and then making an appearance in court on Friday, July the 23rd, was quickly found innocent of any involvement in the murder. Fatima Kama and Youssef Wahid had little in common. Fatima was an outgoing young woman with a dream. Wahid, on the other hand, was described as a sullen and quiet individual. It was also said that Youssef may have shown a romantic interest in Fatima, an interest that was not mutually felt. The first overwhelming piece of evidence turned up in the form of a series of security camera videos. It showed Yusuf Wahid travelling through Paddington Station on July 17th, bound for the Heathrow Express train, which brings passengers into the airport. He was then seen struggling to get a large suitcase off of a train at Heathrow. The airport surveillance cameras then caught him making his way through the airport, pushing the same suitcase. He was finally seen on level 2 of the airport's Terminal 3 car park, but abandoned the suitcase on level 3, where there were no security cameras at the time. The Metropolitan Police quickly tracked down Wahid in his home village of Ramadiyah, near the coast of southern Lebanon, but he denied any knowledge of the murder. London made a request to the Lebanese police force to question him in Beirut, but permission was not granted. They were told, however, that they could be present when he was questioned by them. This was not good enough for the London police, and as there was no treaty in place for offenders to be extradited from Lebanon to the UK, London needed time to present a solid case in order to do so. They replied to the Lebanese invitation on July 31st, 1999, saying, "The arrest and detention of Wahid for the murder of Fatima Kama is not sought at this time. Therefore, in relation to the allegation, he should be released immediately. An evidence file will be submitted in due course and put to the UK Crown Prosecution Service for consideration for a formal request through diplomatic channels for the extradition of Wahid. In view of the above information, our officers will not be coming to Lebanon as previously stated." This was a devastating move by the London police for the family of Fatima Kama, but one that, given the complex legalities involved in an extradition, was necessary. Up until now, no criminal had ever been successfully extradited back to the UK from the Middle East. Scotland Yard knew they had a lengthy process ahead of them. The Lebanese continued to investigate the case on their own though, and in 2001 they found Wahid guilty and sentenced him to death in absentia. But Wahid did not settle on Lebanese soil. Knowing that Lebanon or Britain could catch up with him at any time, he remained on the move, travelling from one Middle Eastern country to another, eventually abandoning his passport in Saudi Arabia. It was inevitable, though, that one day he would either return to his home in Lebanon or settle elsewhere, and eventually become complacent over time, and that he did. Fatima's family were not prepared to wait though, and in 2002, her father travelled to London in a bid to open a fresh appeal and renew the investigation, but sadly his efforts failed. London's police force were presented with an opportunity 8 years later in the shape of Bahrain. Yusuf Wahid, after years on the run, eventually moved there, settling into his new life as a businessman. Relations between the UK and Bahrain were stronger than with Lebanon, and an extradition agreement was made between the two nations in 2010. On August 24, 2010, the now married father of two at the age of 41 was arrested. He was then flown back to London on September 8th, where he was apprehended by London police at the same airport he had left Fatima Kama's body 11 years before. Wahid tried to argue that his extradition had been unlawful. In fact, it was one of historical significance, as it was reportedly the first successful extradition from a Middle Eastern country to the UK. £50,000 worth of money and jewellery, thought to have been stolen by Wahid after Fatima had withdrawn it from a safety deposit box, was never recovered. Miss Kama had also been raped, but police were unclear whether the initial motive had been money or lust. They thought it likely that one had led to the other as the opportunity arose. It also transpired that Wahid had brazenly returned to the city for a short while after abandoning Fatima's body. There he shaved his moustache and prepared for his flight, before returning to Heathrow and boarding his plane. At first he denied ever being in Britain, but changed his mind when presented with fingerprints matching his that were taken from the crime scene. If this wasn't enough, his DNA also matched semen samples taken from Fatima's body. His trial took place at the Old Bailey in August of 2011, and he stood before Judge Paul Worsley. He changed his defending lawyer several times, making life difficult for them by refusing to enter the court after the prosecution case. He eventually turned down legal representation altogether, wrongly believing that this would invalidate his trial. He did, however, return to court to hear the guilty verdict, and requested his legal representation be reinstated for the sentencing hearing, which took place on October the 3rd. After just 2.5 hours, he was found guilty by an 11-1 jury, and was sentenced to life in prison. He would have to serve 24 years before being eligible for parole. He denied murdering the 28-year-old singer and former accountancy student, right up until he was led away from the courtroom. A 12-year manhunt had come to an end. Detective Chief Inspector John McFarlane, who had headed the investigation, summed it up when he faced the press following the trial. He said, "This was a callous and shocking murder, which has left the family grieving the loss of a beloved daughter. They have spent the last 12 years with no answers as to why this tragedy happened. I am pleased that finally they have had justice." But nothing the police or anyone else could say could make life easier for Fatima's family. Her father, 66-year-old Fatima Kama, said that her mother had cried non-stop for 3 years following their daughter's death. He praised the Metropolitan Police though, admitting that he thought justice would never be done.